Hello and welcome to County Board Wrap-Up, our look at the key actions the board takes at its monthly meeting. I'm Kara O'Donnell, and today I'm going to be chatting with County Board Chair Christian Dorsey, as well as board member Eric Gutschall about the decisions they made at the November meeting that impact you, your family, and our community. Well, let's start off. We are in budget season yet again.
Aren't we always in budget season?
It kind of seems that way, but this is, I guess, the official kickoff of budget season. So what are some of the big hot items on this year's budget?
Well, I think the top line probably is that after a couple of years of looking at really constrained budgets where we were expecting revenue that was in no way sufficient to deal with continuing our existing levels of service, the outlook is different this year. And the manager's forecast look like we should have sufficient revenues to have a continuing services budget without requiring any dramatic changes in program delivery or increases in the tax rate. So we have asked the manager to prepare a proposed budget that does not rely on increasing the tax rate to come into balance. And in fact, if revenues are sufficient enough, we want him to give us alternatives for tax rate reductions, and that's something that I think after a couple of years of really difficult choices that we've had to make should be welcome news to our community.
I would think so. Now, to what can we attribute that uptick a little bit?
Well, you know, many people will say, is it the Amazon
effect?
Well,
that was my next thing. Everybody kind of assumes that that's it, but that's still pretty early in the early stages.
Yeah, not so much. It doesn't appear that Amazon is really driving this at all, and we wouldn't expect it to. They've hired about 100 employees thus far. Most of them, I think, were already within the region, so there really hasn't been any real shifting of people, nor have they made any substantial capital investments yet. So this is really not about the Amazon effect, but just what is cyclical strength in mostly the commercial real estate market, which, as we know, was a significant depressor of revenues over the past few years. And now that's shifted and hopefully will continue to shift upwards, which is also good news for residential taxpayers. It means that overall our budget outlook has improved.
How about things like, from what we had discussed back in the spring, things like the metro funding, the school funding, some of those things that are always kind of hot button issues?
Yeah. So, schools is an unknown. They run their own parallel budget process, so we don't yet know whether or not they're in the same position that we're looking at, where expected revenues should allow for them to deliver their program. That remains to be seen. But with Metro, the good news is that we have at least predictability in Metro's needs, so that has been baked in, so to speak, to our budget outlook. So we don't anticipate any real downside surprises to Metro, with one key caveat. There's a significant component of Metro which is unresolved at this point, and that is when the Silver Line Phase 2 will commence operations. That will have a budget impact, but it's too early to tell exactly how large that will be.
And they're saying sometime summer, fall of next year-ish?
I got to tell you, Kara, it could be anywhere. The earliest it could happen is around July 1st, 2020, okay. But if I were a betting person, I would not think that we're going to come anywhere really close to that date, given all of the outstanding issues that are going on
there. Somebody takes that line. I'm heavily invested in that particular news.
Maybe we'll do another County Board wrap-up about that.
How about any other things? What have you been hearing from the public, from the residents? Obviously, there will be plenty of time for residents to weigh in on their concerns with the proposed budget, but is there anything that's kind of bubbling to the surface early on?
I think it's a little early right now in terms of, other than we had some specific advocacy around the recently adopted closeout funding, which is where we take what's left over from last year and we carry that forward into next year. We had some advocacy from our affordable housing and safety net community, but what we will be, as we gear up for this cycle that is just beginning now, the manager will come forward with his officially proposed budget in February, and then we will have a couple of months there until we ultimately adopt in April the budget, where we certainly expect to hear from all aspects of the community. That will be the schools community, that will be our nonprofits, that will be the business community, that will be all the stakeholders throughout the community who are going to let us know how they feel about what has been proposed and where we need to focus efforts. And then the other potential caveat to that, but which really gets more into our capital improvement plan cycle, would be stormwater funding to respond to the stormwater, the need for to update our stormwater infrastructure that has we've known about for quite some time, but it was really quite evident in the funding that we, or the flooding that we had last summer. So we're looking forward to the discussion around that, and just so everyone understands that we've got the budget first, and then following on to that will be the capital improvement cycle, which we ultimately adopt in June.
So, but the good news is, right off the top, is we are not facing another year of potential cuts in services or personnel, that belt tightening that we've seen the last couple of years. This is more a stay the course for now.
Well, we may change program delivery, but that's going to be in the sake of being more efficient and prioritizing what needs to be done. We're not going to be doing it as a fundamental necessity to maintain our basic levels of service, which is a much better place to be.
It is,
yes.
And I actually think that the hot topic that we're going to end up finding as we move through this cycle is going to be balancing the growth in revenue, which fortunately is largely on the commercial side, but that also includes commercial residential, rental apartments, multifamily units, which means the higher the taxes are on those, the more that impacts rents. And we know that there is pressure on, upward pressure on rents. And so ultimately, I think our conversation at the board is going to be, how do we balance delivering the services and the amenities and all of the things that people want from their local government in a way that keeps affordability in the county, in the community, at a level that people are comfortable with and are able, that we're not displacing, in particular, those that are most vulnerable to even modest increases in their taxes.
Okay, so we will, I'm sure, be talking about this many, many times in the months to come. But moving on for just a moment, another action from the board meeting was the changes the board made to some of the density regulations. Let's talk about, A, what those changes are and where this came from. Why were these needed?
Well, what we did is we did a couple of things. And first of all, is we revised the definition of what we allow for our incentive programs, for bonus incentives, the definition of affordable and low to moderate income. We wanted to make sure that we had, as we move forward with implementation of the Housing Arlington initiative, that we had the maximum flexibility to target across the spectrum of income. So not just those at the very bottom and those making below 60% of area median income, but actually able to look at tools that would allow us to address those making up to a higher level, whether that's 120 or 150%. We weren't very specific on what the upper level is, and so that was one important change that we made. We also, and it's a very technical kind of amendment, but we adjusted where we are, how we handle the maximum allowed bonus density for developers that are willing to provide affordable housing. That had a cap on it, and we frequently found that cap, where there were sites and applications that were coming in for redevelopment, where actually the community could agree there was more room on this site to actually provide more housing, but our zoning ordinance did not give us that flexibility and allow us to do that. So we wanted to modernize the zoning ordinance and allow where we could consider that additional density, where the plans allow for it and where the site can support it and the infrastructure can support it. And so we wanted to do that as well. And then likewise, sort of the inverse, the yin to the yang, if you will, on that was where we allow for bonus height. We had previously in the zoning ordinance allowed there was no cap on the amount of height that the board had the authority to grant in exchange for affordable housing. And what we said is, well, if we're going to remove the cap on density, is we wanted to go ahead and tighten it up just a little bit on the height to make sure that we are consistent, that we're moving forward in a very thoughtful, planful way. Arlington, well known for our planning processes, and we didn't want to allow things to get out of hand, frankly. We know that we're going to be delivering and working on how to produce and deliver a whole lot more housing, but how we grow matters, and we want to make sure we're doing that in a way that the planning surrounds that, so that we're providing for all of the infrastructure, everything from stormwater in schools and roads and transportation facilities. All of those things all need to be accounted for in the density that we approve.
Now, and on that, is then this limited to perhaps the metro corridors or certain areas, or is this countywide for any buildings in the county?
Well, so the bonus density for housing provisions are available wherever it's allowed. So that's something that we found a useful tool. As Eric said, we were essentially limiting our ability to consider really good proposals that had broad community support, which as a public servant doesn't make any sense. If everybody wants something to happen, that you have a constraint limiting you from even considering it and having a conversation, that was sort of the low-hanging fruit, and that's really a key takeaway from this. We've said, you know what, let's take away that artificial barrier, because when it comes to community facilities and housing, we're not going to let something that was developed years ago having the unintended consequence of limiting our ability to deliver that today. So that level of flexibility is available everywhere. We did have conversations about height and changes to height and considering what the board could consider at a particular time, and that's a little bit more wonky and is more limited based on different planning areas and different plans that govern a particular area, but this one is something that applies countywide.
Okay, we are going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we're going to look at a mixed-use redevelopment that's going to transform an entire block in Ballston. Stay with us. We're back with County Board Wrap-Up, and with me here today is Board Chair Christian Dorsey, as well as Board Member Eric Gutschall, and we're talking about the decisions the board made at its November meeting. Now, in a moment, we'll take a look at the future of Jennie Dean Park, but let's start with the planned transformation of an entire block of North Glebe Road. Now, we've been talking about this Harris Teeter site for a long time, but things are finally moving along. Let's talk about that.
Well, the board heard this this time around, and we did vote to approve it. It's an exciting project. For folks that know where the current Harris Teeter is on the west side of Glebe Road in Ballston, that area will be redeveloping now. They will keep the existing Harris Teeter in place while they develop the new one. That will be where the existing parking lot is. Okay. And then the new Harris Teeter will be surrounded by 3 different buildings that have 732 new market rate apartment units. And what the community is getting out of it is we are getting the implementation of a plan that we have long had for this site. It's known as the West Quincy Addendum to the Sector Plan. And what it has is it's got a new park that will help to connect this site to the surrounding neighborhood. The buildings will taper in height towards the lower density neighborhood that's around it. We've got some new streets that will be coming through the site to allow for good circulation. And we've also got obviously the return of a new and improved Harris Teeter. It's going to be a modern format store, they have told us, so I think it's going to be very exciting. It's going to be there to help serve this part of the county as it continues to grow, and the developers help to fulfill our plans.
Now, and I was just going to say, there's been a lot of growth in that area, not just even the Ballston Quarter project across the street, but there have been a lot of new residential, ground level retail type things all along that stretch.
That's
so. What have you heard from the residents about how much are they looking forward to this particular project? Or
I think that there was some work that the developer had to do throughout our public engagement process to bring the plan more into compliance, their proposal more into compliance with our plans. And some of the immediate neighbors had specific concerns that actually the developer worked very hard to try to ameliorate. In particular, and it shows the value of the process, at our hearing, the developer offered up some additional green roof
about
space
10,000
on
square
roof,
feet,
10,000
yeah.
square feet
Yeah.
that they offered up at our hearing, which was in response directly to some of the concerns of the immediate neighbors who are in an existing high-rise building that actually that looks down upon the roof of this. So they wanted to make the roof look better, but that also fulfills our sustainability goals because a green roof helps to mitigate the heat island effect when you have development, helps to filter the water, helps to slow rainwater down, so helps us with our stormwater requirements. We also had the opportunity through this project, the developer will be making a contribution of $4.1 million towards our Affordable Housing Investment Fund. And so that's going to help. And that also was, affordable housing is a much sought after goal of the community. So by and large, the surrounding community, the neighborhoods were supportive of this. There were a few details that we had to work through, and the applicant, working with our staff, did a great job of bringing this to us, where I think it was a relatively easy vote for us. This had been through the process and was ready to go.
Yeah, I mean, there were people who wanted to see maybe some better architecture, some different choices made, but when you step back from a macro level, the one thing that everybody agreed with was that Harris Teeter, about a third larger than the existing one, was going to be welcome to everyone. And certainly when you're getting at an almost 2/3 of an acre park, there was a lot to like here. And on balance, I think people did appreciate that. If you can't get perfect, making sure that there are some clear benefits from redevelopment that accrue to the broader community is important, and this one delivered it.
Yeah.
So what's the time frame we're looking at?
I think they want to be aggressive, and I think they're going to probably start as early as possible, but I do want to underscore what Eric said at the very beginning. Their entire plan, since this Harris Teeter is one of the more successful ones in the company's portfolio, it will remain open at all times through redevelopment. So they are going to build the new store first while keeping the existing one open, transfer full operations to the new store, and then develop around it. So this neighborhood, our community, will not go without the benefits of a grocery store at all because of this project.
Right. And also I think it's important to note that the county does not actually have control over when they choose to start construction. Now they have entitlement to begin construction. It's up to them on their timeline, although I think, as Christian said, they clearly have all indications that they're looking forward to get started quickly. But just so everyone knows, that's not in our control.
Not on your and then the board also awarded a very large construction contract for Jennie Dean Park. Tell me a little bit about that.
So this is about a $15.5 million contract to do the first phase of reconstruction of Jennie Dean Park, and this is something that we've talked about for a while too as part of the 4 Mile Run Valley master plan and park planning process. And I'll just get to the basics. Jennie Dean is an almost 13-acre park. And as part of this, we are getting 2 new lighted diamond fields, as well as playgrounds for children of young ages and then middle ages, a new basketball court, some gender-neutral bathrooms, picnic pavilions, some historical interpretive elements. This is really going to be a crown jewel park in Arlington, and it recognizes that we've neglected Jennie Dean Park for far too long, and it's at the cusp of the convergence of the Green Valley neighborhood with Shirlington, and really serves as a huge regional magnet for athletics and leisure, casual recreation. So we want to make sure that this park is able to serve all of its multiple stakeholders well. And I'm just excited because I think there's going to be money well spent, and it's going to really help serve to be the key catalyst to realizing the plans for the 4 Mile Run area that our community works so hard on.
This is a very popular park. I mean, just
Yeah.
neighborhoods, it's well used, shall we say.
Indeed.
Now, is it just upgrades for the most part, or are there new things that are not there now that the public can expect to see?
Definitely more than just upgrades. So the fields exist, and lighting exists, even though it's inadequate. And the basketball court and tennis court exist presently, but those will all be improved. But then you're going to get some new pavilions, which are going to allow for people to have that sort of casual use. There are going to be some historical interpretive elements which have never existed before, which pay homage to the Green Valley community and the neighborhood's history. So substantial amounts of new stuff, in addition to ensuring that the old elements are in a state of modern repair so that those can be utilized more so than laying dormant as they often are now.
One of my favorite parts about it, Christian, actually, is that I think the park, what we'll find is it has much more of a connection to the stream that is right there.
I forgot the overlook.
Exactly. It's going to be an overlook, and we're actually going to do some stream restoration to make sure that that the stream bank is stabilized. If you go there now, it's sort of outside the fence, and you don't really, it's there, but you don't really, interact with it in any particular way. And so I think it's we're slightly adjusting the location and the orientation of the ball fields, and that opens up. There's going to really be, I think, a fantastic community amenity to be able to enjoy a much more natural setting and to make sure that it's stabilized and that stream area, that natural area, is preserved for generations to come.
All right, well, it's a very exciting project as it comes to fruition. Well, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, I'll be asking the board members about new regulations for scooters in Arlington, as well as about the county's legislative priorities for the 2020 General Assembly session. Welcome back to County Board Wrap-Up, where each month we chat with the board members about key actions the board's taken at its regular meeting. With us today are Board Chair Christian Dorsey, as well as Board Member Eric Gutschall. And we've been talking about these scooters for long, but the regulations have now come in. Throughout this whole process, what would you say is the most surprising thing that came out of the whole study and then when the regulations were put into place here?
That's a great question. I see three surprising things for me. One, I kind of had, I thought it was a better than 50% chance when we began this pilot that by the end of the pilot, this would no longer be a viable business model. So that it is, that's a surprise. But two, I think the way in which people are using them has also been a surprise. Our data collected during the pilot has revealed that these are replacing largely car trips. So people are using them not to substitute for public transit. They are really either replacing car trips or they are trips that they would not have otherwise made. So they're providing a real niche, a real sort of need, if you will. That was illuminating. And then third, despite our messaging, it has not penetrated that this pilot was never the result of the county soliciting the scooter companies to come solve a community problem, but rather we had no ability to deny them entry into our community. And in fact, during this pilot, the General Assembly passed legislation which explicitly forbids localities from banning them and subjects them to certain state regulations if in fact the counties don't act in certain regulatory areas by the end of the calendar year. So that's a really important message that never really penetrated. A lot of people in our community beseeched us to ban them. And it was tough to break through that, no, we can't do that. We have to figure out how it works.
So in other words, this study helps to work in a way that makes as many people happy as is possible.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I thought that was interesting is there has been a lot of controversy back and forth over whether or not these scooters should be allowed on sidewalks. And whether they were allowed to or not, people were riding them on sidewalks. So the idea of speed restrictions now on the sidewalks, tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So, I'll just say quickly, and Eric, you jump in here. The sidewalk thing was something that was very difficult because during the pilot, we actually had a statutory ban on having the scooters ride on the sidewalks. But what we found was without any adequate enforcement mechanism, that was something that was clearly flouted frequently, and we were powerless to stop it without devoting significant resources to enforcement of scooters, which would bring up its own host of concerns. So the question for us was, given the behavior, how do you best deal with the situation where you either have to spend tons to enforce the ban, or do you try something else? And we've opted, for at least the time being, to try and create a culture of compliance around having people ride at lower speeds and being more mindful that the sidewalks create greater conflicts, which should require you to be, if you're on a scooter, more vigilant and to slow down. And we think that we've got some tools that can make that work.
It's definitely a delicate balancing act. We heard at the public hearing a lot of testimony from disabled members of the community who are worried, from seniors. We had a letter from our Commission on Aging that was worried about, when someone who's older and maybe a little bit more frail if they were to be bumped into by somebody on these scooters, especially moving at a high rate of speed, you or I, we might get knocked over, we get up, we dust ourselves off, we're probably okay. But somebody who's older could have a much more serious and it becomes a major impact on their ongoing health. And so I think we were very mindful of that. And I actually think that the community can be very proud of the process that we went through, the really thoughtful manner in which our staff analyzed all of these concerns. None of these concerns were dismissed out of hand. And as Christian just described, we really tried to come up with a program that is within our authority under state law, that allows us to accept this as an innovative technology that does actually meet real needs in the community for that very critical in our transportation environment, that what's known as first mile, last mile, which creates new opportunities for people to get where they need to go in and around the community, but to do it in a safe way. And I really think that that's actually, for me, what this whole conversation, we had a great conversation among board members, where it's just, we are in a moment in time right now where this is still relatively new, but we are really looking down the road. Where are we headed? That culture of compliance, the idea of that there's going to be multiple modes of travel. And by the way, these regulations, we talk about scooters, and e-scooters are certainly the most visible, but this also applies to e-bikes. And actually, it made sense to consolidate this with our existing bicycle, traditional, pedal-powered bicycle regulations. And so we've consolidated to sort of future-proof this, if you will, or future-ready it, where as we move forward and perhaps other sorts of technologies come online, that we have a model here that says we want to be able for people to get around, but we want them to do so safely. We want to respect each other. The golden rule is if you're moving faster than somebody else, you don't run them over, you signal when passing, and you have etiquette. You exercise judgment and etiquette, and that's what we're hoping. Exactly.
And this applies to motorized skateboards and a new mode that we heard about at the public hearing, motorized unicycles.
I have not seen these.
Neither have I.
Okay,
Neither have I.
something to
We
look
had
forward
someone
to.
bring
The
it up
one
to
thing
us.
I wanted to touch on before we move on is that I found very interesting is that there's a move to have parking areas, for lack of a better way of putting it, the kind of corrals for people to.
This is part of
place
the
these
etiquette,
scooters.
right?
Yeah.
It's not appropriate, and this was a very compelling testimony from a few disabled members of our Disability Advisory Commission, who very eloquent spoke to the fact that when we see scooters just laying across the sidewalk, if you're in a wheelchair, it's not as easy to just go around them or jump over them or do whatever. And so it's just not appropriate. And so we have laid out very clear guidelines on where they can be, either in corrals. Our Department of Transportation staff are working on, many people may have seen the new striping where there's, at the end of a row of on-street parking, you might see a corral painted in there. It says it's suitable for either dockless bikes or these e-scooters. And there's rules about where they can be on the sidewalk, that is essentially that they're out of the way. They should not be in the main flow. And we've got the teeth now and the agreements that we have with these vendors that if they don't come out, if there's a report that there's a scooter where it shouldn't be, and they don't come out and retrieve that and relocate it appropriately, or they're consistently out of compliance with these requirements, we have now the administrative remedy with them to either suspend their license or to revoke it if we have to. We hope we certainly don't come to that point. And again, the whole idea is to create a culture of compliance where people have the tools they need and are going to be able to comply with common sense guidelines.
And I don't know about you, Eric. For me, I think that's really the biggest issue with these, more so than necessarily speed and conflicts, even though we don't want people on scooters whizzing around recklessly. But everyone who has traveled on Arlington streets knows that either through carelessness of the user, unresponsiveness of the vendor, or sometimes weather knocking these things over, they can obstruct the right of way. And whether it is someone who is mobility challenged, or they have low vision, or quite frankly, don't expect as they're walking in the public right-of-way to have to navigate around a scooter which has been improperly placed, that's really the thing that most of us deal with. And while I think it's great that we have an ability to ticket and fine and then ultimately penalize the vendors if this happens repeatedly, I just like to make a personal plea. If someone encounters a scooter that's obstructing the right-of-way, that could cause a hazard for someone who is low vision, mobility impaired, or whatever, if you are able, move it. Move it, because while at the end of the day we want this culture of compliance, we also don't want to be complicit in someone else suffering a misfortune if we're able to do something about it.
Okay, and then one quick thing before we go. The board held a public hearing on the 2020 General Assembly legislative package. Just getting an overview, what are the priorities this year?
Well, the priorities are going to continue to be, transportation funding is certainly top of mind. Folks that were following along last year, recall that we had a major breakthrough in that the General Assembly did adopt a funding package that allowed us to stabilize the funding for Metro. Unfortunately, that funding largely came from funding that was going towards the Northern Virginia Transportation Alliance, which is, or Authority, which is critical to funding other projects. So it was a little bit of stealing from Paul to pay Peter. Mm-hmm. And so we're looking forward to an opportunity to rectify that. We need some new funding, because we don't want to see other worthwhile projects being starved for funding in the name of Metro, but certainly we will continue to put an emphasis on Metro. We also, it's a high priority for us for affordable housing, and it's a regional problem. And it needs regional solutions. It's actually, we think of it regionally, but the truth is, and I know this from spending time with our brethren throughout the state and the Virginia Association of Counties, actually all jurisdictions are experiencing affordable housing as a crisis, frankly. And so even though comparatively some other jurisdictions might seem affordable to us, it really is all relative. And so we need new tools and new sources of money, and so we're going to be looking to our legislators to help us figure out how we're going to make sure that we fund our Affordable Housing Trust Fund at a level that actually allows us to respond to the actual need that we have here in Arlington.
All right, well, we will see how that goes as the Assembly gets into session. And that brings us to the end of this month's County Board Wrap-Up. Christian, Eric, thank you both for joining us. And remember, all County Board meetings are open to the public and live streamed and archived on our website. That's arlingtonva.us. Just search County Board. And if you want to tell us what you think about these and other issues, visit the county website at topics.arlingtonva.us/engage. Thank you for watching. We hope to see you back here next month when we'll be wrapping up 2019 with a look at the board's actions from the December meeting.